also talking about you and me and everyone we know. And we, as Lisa was saying, we sat around some tables and we prayed and we asked, Jesus, what are you calling us to meditate on, to think about in our Sunday times together? And we made a really great list. And the top of that list was, what about our core value of diversity? So that's what we're jumping into. I needed to make a slide here that has the two kind of learning aims for this. The two learning aims for this whole series are two things. One, we want to cast a vision for a time when diversity and faith are just natural, assumed allies. We're going to build that future together. That is not always the way it is in our world, and we're going to start living into a vision and laying the groundwork for a time when that is completely natural, assumed, and self-evident. The other teaching aim in all of this is we really want to be a place where everyone belongs. And I think there's an even deeper layer to belonging, that we see each other. So how do we slowly start to be a place where each person can feel seen, experience true connection? Not that we're happy that you came in the door, but this is a place that you belong, something of a spiritual home for you. So those are the two big goals here. Now, typically I have a little accessory. Do we set up my little clicker? We can go without it, but I forgot to grab it. And it's so fragile, I don't want you to just throw it. Although it was tempting, because if I caught it, it would have been legendary. Okay, great. Here we go. You, me, everyone we know, we're dreaming about a world where diversity is the assumed normal thing, and that faith supports that. And we're thinking about how do we experience our faith in such a way that it makes total sense with all the other ways we could be defined. Not as inherently competitive, not as attention, but as an integrated whole. That's what we're trying to build here. So a couple of framing stories for me in my journey. Yeah. Turn this guy on. I turned it off. Now it's back on. It's going to work here in a second. Okay. Maybe it's not. Oh, wrong way. Oh, my bad. Okay. Later, we're going to do a beach cleanup. Okay, then we'll also be doing a fundraiser dinner with Fred Harrell. We've changed it from a gala to a barn raising because gala was too fancy for us, and we're in a season where everybody needs to grab a hammer. This is going to be great. And we've designed the content in such a way where we think anyone could be happy attending this. So invite all your friends. It's like a $1 per plate situation, but also we think that it is just going to be worth time and resources. So Lisa will maybe recap some of that. Here's the big idea of today's talk that we want to get our way through. Each culture has a story of its own that Jesus is working within. And we're going to talk about the couple of ways that Jesus works within our cultures as we unpack this, but that is the big idea. Each culture has a story of its own in which Jesus is working. 3 framing stories for me. I grew up in a predominantly white Midwestern town where I had some friends who were non-white, but gosh, the major way, the primary way I experienced life was as a white person. I went to college at a conservative flagship institution of a very conservative denomination, and there I met one brave professor who said in my junior year New Testament theology class, we were working our way through it, and he said, we cannot talk about the theology of the New Testament unless we talk about race relations. And he shared in our history of our denomination, it was a Pentecostal denomination, he used a term, we have to reckon with the checkered racial history of this denomination if we are to honor the theology of the New Testament. And that was the first time in my life I'd ever heard anyone say something direct and forthright about any kind of race dynamics, especially at church, especially in a way that was critical of the power structures that were there. So I held this man in great esteem, and I wondered, would he get fired? He did not. And I've been unpacking this phrase, checkered racial history. Along the way, I have learned that that in itself was a euphemism for something much darker. That in a predominantly white context, he was being sensitive, even as we talked about race, to the white people in the room to say, you have to reckon with this thing, but I can't name it directly because that might drive you away. And so he said, checkered racial history. When he met something much more painful. And so he shared the history of this denomination, the Assemblies of God. The Pentecostal movement started in Los Angeles, and it was wildly, profoundly diverse. That was its main trait, that in these street revivals in Los Angeles, people of every tongue and tribe and nation would come and gather and sing praises to Jesus. And when that started, within 10 years, the Assemblies of God began as an all-white denomination. And so he was inviting us to reckon with the reality that in 10 short years, it went from a profoundly diverse thing to an all-white deal. And then a different denomination started. That was all black, and then et cetera, et cetera. And so as we inherit today, Sunday mornings are the most segregated time of the week in America. And he invited me to think about that as a college junior at a very conservative place. I admired him greatly, but I treasured it in my heart, and I wondered, what could this mean for me? What must I do to honor this insight from this person that I happen to know and love? So when I went to seminary, I joined the African American Church Studies Department, and sometimes I was the only white person in the class, and that was so eye-opening. I so treasured the chance to be a statistical minority because it was like, oh, this is what some people have every day. And I just didn't know. And so I was learning, how do we converse in meaningful ways? And I went from a place that was predominantly white to Los Angeles, which was so diverse and so wonderful. And at the school I went to, they had a Korean language program and African American church studies. And I thought, this is what heaven must be like. And then I learned, even there, some of those cross-cultural experiences were tricky and painful for everyone involved. And there, Katie and I lived in something that sometimes I call a commune. They called it an intentional community. And the way it worked was, sponsored by the school, everybody in this 50-person community ate dinner together every night. And there were like 10 or 20 kids, people of all ages. It was so much fun. And you just got to know them through this combined dinner. And you were on the cook team and the clean team. It was lovely. My neighbors were this family from Egypt. They had come to the United States to go to seminary to become pastors. They had an 8-year-old son. I loved this kid. So a lot of nights I'd be talking with this guy, be talking with his family. And then I saw him disturbed this one time, this 8-year-old boy. So I went and spoke with him, and he shared how hard it was moving to the United States. And I'd been digesting some of the language, some of the experiences that I had, and I had this intuition that was maybe completely wrong at the time, and this is the way you learn about such things. But I said, I think to be Egyptian is probably a really beautiful thing. And he said, no, to be Egyptian is ugly, and it is death. And I was shocked. I was completely speechless, which doesn't happen a lot to me. And over my friendship with this boy, I learned that he was quite dramatic sometimes and quite poetic. And yet in this very cross-cultural experience of living in the United States, he had internalized something quite profound that was so painful for me to personally witness, that in his mind there was something wrong with the way that he was made, that the identity to which he most identified was somehow working against him. And what I saw in my college classroom was to think of race as an important lens through which I had to acknowledge I saw the world and engage that as a topic. But what I met in this little boy is the visceral pain associated with it in our world is absolutely undeniable. And so in my own little journey of growing up in a predominantly white place to being a person who could maybe see and converse about race, had these important moments for me where I was seeing windows into people's experiences that I could never understand myself. And if I could, it would be in a cerebral and abstract way. But here was an actual person that I loved, an 8-year-old boy who was deeply wounded by this thing that we could hardly name and certainly at the time could not discuss. And so I went on a mission to start trying to build places where we could at least start to discuss what was going on there. How might we unpack that? How might we build a world together where that sort of thing does not happen? That's the dream that we are unpacking here. What if we made a core value out of making sure things like that never happen? So here is the question that I am trying to frame all of this with. How do we engage our ethnicity with our faith, so that we are empowered in our identity in the right ways and corrected in our right ways? See, Jesus is at work in the story of every culture, empowering parts of that culture and correcting it in some ways. And so how do we become people where that is happening within us? How are we a part of that? So how do we engage our ethnicity with our faith? So here are some basic elements of identity. This is a partial list. There's probably lots of things we could add here. Race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality, socioeconomics. We might add to that age, weight, career, all kinds of things. This is a partial list. Now, one of the things about this list is there is some terminology sometimes associated with it, that it is socially constructed. What that means is that we have layered words and symbols and rituals on top of each one of these, and we did the same thing with Christmas. Christmas is a socially constructed reality that we all participate in. There's nothing about the birth of Jesus that says put up a Christmas tree and put some icing on the windows and give away cookies and give gifts to one another. That doesn't instinctually map from the birth of Jesus to the ways that we do it. But over time, we have socially constructed rituals and symbols where we tell ourselves this is the part of story that we are in. So even though it is socially constructed, it is still very real, very impactful for us. Each one of these things has a socially constructed element to them. Now, some of them, like ethnicity, might have a biological basis, but some of them have no biological basis. And the ones we're going to talk about the most is among the most socially constructed here, and that is race. And here we have to be real clear about the origins of the concept of race. It's a relatively new idea in human history to say we divide up into these big categories, broad strokes. A theologian named Willie Jennings wrote a book called The Christian Imagination, which traced the theological origins of race as a concept. It was religious first, and then it became scientific, a way of categorizing and even ranking human races and causing them to compete against one another in ways that we are all actually deeply familiar with. So even though race is the one that is the newest and most socially constructed in our world, it's actually the window, the doorway into this conversation. It's the one that we dialogue about the most. It's the one we experience the most. I heard a really important distinction here once, that race is the way other people might define you, but ethnicity is the way you define yourself, where you get to have a choice there in how you describe that, how you construct that. And the question before us is, how do we help these things interface fruitfully with our faith? So tonight we're going to talk primarily about race and ethnicity. And we're going to talk along the way about an intersectional identity. What does that even mean? That's like one of those great TikTok buzzwords. But it's actually really important. So here's a working definition, very simple. It's how the elements on the previous list, and then maybe several other more elements, come together or intersect to form our identities. It's all the parts of you coming together at once. I once heard somebody say, actually, you are the intersection of all of the elements of your identity. They come together in you to form you. So that's what we're talking about. And we're thinking about race and ethnicity. There's simply one aspect of the gift of being a human being. See, everything on that list is a part of getting to be alive as a human. It's an irreducible part of being human. It's a gift to be human. It's a gift to get to be alive. And these are fundamental, irreducible parts of it that we have to grapple with. That for certain power-laden reasons we sometimes sweep under the rug, but here we're going to bring them out and say, how do we really look directly at these as best we can and find out that they are somehow a gift to us? So I want to start by talking about Jesus. Now, quite profoundly, between the Reformation in the 1500s and about World War II, there was an anti-Semitic strain in New Testament thinking, rooted in Germany. The Reformation happened primarily in Germany, and then the best theological institutions in the world arose over the next couple of hundred years there. And they worked very hard to erase what we might call the Jewishness of Jesus. So they said, well, he was primarily a Greek thinker, or he was completely unique. But the truth is, he had a very clear ethnic identity that makes it impossible to understand him unless we really acknowledge and embrace that Jesus, as the preeminent true human being, had an ethnicity quite like yours or mine, with all kinds of different important details and stories that is an irreducible part of being a human being. So it's not even an accident, it's not even part of the context, it's actually a main plot point that all those years they were simply missing. And so Jesus said things like this: I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. That is rooted so deeply in his Jewishness that it is intelligible. We cannot tell what it means unless we say, oh, he is a Jewish person living out a Jewish story. And what he meant here was, I have come to fulfill the promises made by God to these particular people. See, it is because of God's integrity to honor the promises that God made that Jesus says, I have come only to the lost sheep of Israel. If we don't grapple with the ethnic identity of Jesus, we will never understand what he was trying to say or do. But for 500 years in New Testament thinking and in churches everywhere, we missed out on such an important part that God was faithful to his promises by embracing Jesus' Israelite identity. Now, Jesus' follower, Paul the Apostle, walked on foot, planted churches just like this one, wrote letters back to them. He too was a first century Jew. And he understood the assignment that Jesus was laying down, because Paul wrote it this way: "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of salvation for the Jew first, and then for the Gentile." And he understood Jesus' message, that in the history of God, he had chosen a people, small and oppressed, to align himself with them, to love them, to be a chosen people, and that somehow through Jesus, God was fulfilling his promises to those people and expanding them to the world. But we will never understand Paul the Apostle until we embrace that he had a very specific lens that he was viewing the world through. Because having a very specific lens that you view the world through is an irreducible, fundamental part of being a human being. We all have this lens. And if we don't learn to understand the lens we are putting on the world, we will never understand what we see. And that's what happens to Paul the Apostle, that as the Western world kind of tried to erase the ethnicities in the Bible, they started to misunderstand them. Maybe you have heard of Apostle Paul as one of the least popular people in the Bible, and that is because we have misunderstood him. We have erased one of the most fundamental parts of his being, and so it is hard to read him and understand what he was saying, what he was about. That he thought the promises to the Jewish nation were coming true in Jesus and being expanded to the world. Now, that is an important part of that, but at the end of the story, the plot point is, finally, the last words of the Bible are, God has come to dwell with his people, and he will wipe away every tear. It's a beautiful ending. And when God has gathered all of his people in heaven, the Bible describes them in this way in Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. A guy named John of Patmos is having this vision of what the end of the world might look like. And he says, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every tribe, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing there before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands." As an asterisk here, how amazing is it that our God identifies himself as a lamb, a wounded lamb on the throne? That's a different sermon, but we can't pass up that image. It's too beautiful. And instead of scary and full of meteors, sometimes people think that the Bible is this big scary God, but he says, "I am a wounded lamb on the throne, and the people from every tribe have gathered to worship." Now, back to the sermon at hand. They aren't erasing the ethnicities of all humanity. They're not some vague, abstract humanity. Instead, they are very specifically, back to the last one, from every nation, every tribe, every people, every language. That in heaven, we retain this fundamental bit of our humanity. And what we're going to see here is the next slide. Race and ethnic identities are part of what it means to be a human being. If we're going to worship Jesus in heaven, we will retain our essential humanity. That isn't some optional thing that we could imagine ourselves to be apart from. That is an essential part of the story. And so we have this big question. So how does our faith relate to, how does it interface with our race or ethnicity? And here we have to ask, what is a human being? The Bible tells this story of a craftsman, artist God creating the world. And scholars tell us if we know how to understand the details of Genesis chapter 1 and 2, what is being created there is not just the beautiful cosmos, but actually a grand temple in which God plans to dwell. And when you look at the way the Hebrew temple was built, inside they painted all the moons and stars and planets because they're saying this is a small working model of the grander cosmos. That God dwells in the temple because someday he will dwell in all of existence, that God is creating this grand temple for his presence to dwell, that is all of creation. And in the ancient world, in the middle of the temple, they would put a small carved image with which the presence of the God that this temple was dedicated to, that God would dwell there. And there was even a ceremony called the opening of the mouth where they would invite the God to come and live near or in this particular thing. And the Hebrews believed because Yahweh was a living God, he needed a living image, and that was human beings, put in the center of the cosmic temple that he planned to dwell within us. See, what is a human being? It's a place where God's Spirit is intended to dwell. That's what you were designed for. And when God's Spirit dwells within us, when the Spirit of Jesus resides within us, the Bible tells us we become defined by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, generosity, and self-control, the fruits of the Spirit. That is the evidence of God dwelling within us. And so it gives us this model for how does our faith interface fruitfully, powerfully with our ethnic identities, that Jesus is at work in the story of every culture, because when his Spirit lives within me, when I embrace the irreducible humanity of my ethnic identity, there are parts of that identity that glow and shine as something that has Jesus' fingerprints on it, that can point people towards him. Every culture has a bit somewhere within it that can point people towards God that is beautiful and profound. And then every culture has a bit that can make people miserable. A couple of months ago, we went through a series where we talked about the word sin in the Bible, and we said, actually, there's some theologians who believe that the Greek and Hebrew concept should no longer be translated as the English word sin, because the word sin is too laden with guilt and shame, and it might better be translated as misery. And so you get these amazing passages that Jesus was the Lamb of God who has come to take away the misery of the world. And part of what the Holy Spirit teaches us within our ethnicity and culture is that there are parts that can be amazing and pointing towards God, and then there are parts that can make us truly miserable in the way of human sin. See, the problem of human beings is we cannot tell them apart. I need a guide to know which is which. Here is but one example. I'm a person of European descent, and in European intellectual history, they invented something called the individual. There was a moment when they said, you are best defined not as a group of people, but as a one singular person. So René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. This is an extremely individualist concept of human knowledge. Individualism has brought so many good things into the world. A sense of egalitarianism, a sense that we can all own our own story, a sense that you have human rights. We think of those as treasured and cherished. But there's also a part of individualism that has caused us to idolize self-sufficiency so that we are entirely on our own, sometimes lonely, but often overwhelmed, that we miss out on all the benefits of community because we have installed individualism as our primary operating software. We miss out on the other parts, other different, maybe better ways of being human. So in our world, there is an epidemic of loneliness. We have missed out on community. So in this one idea of individualism, we can point out ways where it said, yes, I'm certain that Jesus is pleased with human rights and egalitarianism. And I am certain that his heart is broken by the loneliness epidemic and the collapse of community. And we need the Spirit within us guiding us to filter the impact of these identities and concepts and thought forms on our world. So it is but one idea from my one own perspective. But I think it helps us see a model for the way the Holy Spirit animates and interacts with some of these identities. Now, I've been talking as best I can from just a particular location, right? Locality is one of the main ways we start to describe what is the position from which I view the world. And in next week, we'll see that once we get really clear about where we are, our position in the world, cisgendered white dude, then I can start to see myself clearly, and then I can also start to see you more clearly. We'll live into that together. Now, sometimes people will talk in a way where they will share something like, hey, Matt, something you said was white supremacist. And they're not thinking KKK or burning crosses. They're thinking you are embracing a world where some cultures are elevated over other cultures. And almost always in our world, when one culture is elevated over another culture, that is people of European descent being elevated or elevating themselves. So here's the way I think of this, that as we allow Jesus to fill us with his Spirit, we live in a world where, of course, every identity needs to be surrendered to Jesus. But we live in a world where some identities are put down here. And if we are going to really surrender these identities to Jesus, they have to be brought up to this level. We have to elevate some of the identities that our world naturally puts down so that we can all live into an equality that God has designed us for. And so we're going to be teasing away, we're going to be filtering and thinking about how are we embracing or resisting a world that creates inequality in us and among us. A couple more stories, or at least one more story and a few observations. When I was part of the African American Church Studies Department, we read a book called The Afrocentric Idea by Molefi Asante, and he's observing that in most of the world, the United States is the center of the story, the Western world, the way Westerners think, and they're exporting Western culture all over the place. But how would it be different if we reimagined the story so that Africa was the center, the primary lens? And then each chapter he went through, well, marriages would be different, Communities would be different. Education would be different. Classrooms would be different. And it was a profound exercise to throw into sharp relief and contrast the way we sort of can assume a Western normalcy, that is the main way or only way of viewing the world. And it was this moment where I said, oh my gosh, I have missed out on so much of being a human being because I did not know the lens through which I saw the world. And I have missed on so much of understanding Jesus, whom I claim to follow, because he was not a Western-centered white male. This was a moment where I had to say, finally, truly, wow, there's such a limit to the way that I have been viewing the world. And next week, when we take a look at the way we are designed for diversity, we'll see the gift that it is to find out I've been viewing the world in this tiny little way when I could have been viewing it in a much larger, grander, more freeing way. And then after that, the week after that, we'll talk about this profound task that the universe and maybe God himself has given to each and every one of you. You are tasked with becoming yourself. See, we're on a journey where we're taking those parts of the intersectional identity and we're learning how they come together, and we're sort of choosing the roadmap, how they fit together and how our faith animates or filters them. And so there's this great quote that there's tons of these throughout Christian history, but here's just one from a psychologist whose name is David something with a B. Maybe. Yes, here it is. David Benner. I couldn't remember if it was Brenner. And then I was like, is that Hulk? No, that's Banner. So, psychologist David Benner put it this way, the gift of being yourself. There is no deep knowing of God without a deep knowing of self. And no deep knowing of self without a deep knowing of God. See, if you don't go on this journey to think real clearly about your intersectional identity and how the Holy Spirit helps guide and shape it, you're going to miss out on knowing yourself. And all of Christian history have said, then you will therefore miss out on knowing God. So I need you. We need each other to go on this journey of knowing ourselves so that we might therefore in a fruitful way know this God who created us, who crafted us, who designed us for diversity. And that's what we're doing over the next couple of weeks. Otzi and Keo helped shape this talk. They were very generous and thoughtful in some of their feedback, but I asked Keo to come up and say all the ways he thought I was completely wrong. So, give it up for Keo. Yes. No pressure to disagree, but I gave him full permission to share any and all of his thoughts. Thank you, Keo.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Keo. I'm part of the leadership team. And I really appreciate Matt really leading with humility in terms of this conversation and what leadership can look like by asking for feedback as he's talking about things and really even asking for correction. I'll say for myself, that's a little awkward. I'm not used to or have never had a lot of experience with correcting pastors. So I'm just going to say that that's going to be awkward for me. But I'm going to start with just a little bit of background about myself, because I think just like Matt was talking about his experience, right, this is going to be based off of my experience. And I grew up in Hawaii. When I was a kid, I identified as Chinese, I identified as Japanese, I identified as Okinawan. I identified by my ethnic identity, right? And then I came to college, and I was at a school that was, at the time, was predominantly white. It was about 70% white. And I realized I was Asian. I know it sounds stupid, but it was the first time I was like, kind of linked with Vietnamese Americans, right, or Korean Americans, and it was beyond what my experience was before. And so I just really appreciated that, because that actually led me to a passion of ethnic studies. So my academic background is in ethnic studies and social work. I'm a social worker right now, and I really love having these conversations and engaging in critical thinking about race and racial justice. And I really am appreciative of how we're talking about it intersects with our faith, because for myself, when I was in college, I felt like I had to identify either as a Christian or care about talking about my racial identity. And it wasn't until college that I was able to kind of talk about both. And so the fact that Matt is wanting us to think about both is really kind of a joy for me, because it feels like it's a way for us to embrace all of who we are, right? How we experience the world, how other people experience us, right? And how we experience God, right? Because as he said, it really broadens. And so I feel like I'm rambling, so I'm going to go straight into why I appreciate that is there are a couple things that, not a lot of big things, but some of the things that I wanted to bring up was one of the things that you talked about was racism and where they're not internalizing their feelings. I think that that's great. I also want to talk about how that's really about us partnering with people, right? Not solving other people's problems, but really leaning into that humility that Matt is demonstrating by asking questions, right? And being willing to be corrected, and by really listening the way that Jesus listened. And so I just really appreciate all of what you're saying, Matt. And I think that's the biggest things that I have to say. It's because it's really helping us to lean into an opportunity to lean into self-reflection, right? Lean into humility and active listening. And I'm really looking forward to the next part of this series where we can see how we can engage with other people and learn and listen to other people and their experiences. And so that's my biggest feedback. So thank you, Matt, for this. I do have to go back to one announcement, though. So it was the very first slide that Matt showed, because we were talking about community, right? And how we're talking about if we can have these conversations, we'll grow deeper in community. And one of the ways that we can also grow deeper in community is by serving together. And so at the end of this month, we are also going to be serving together in Half Moon Bay for a beach cleanup. It's something that you can do with your kids. It's something you can do with your family, your partner. It's something you can do by yourself. So we encourage everybody to come if you're able to. We also just encourage you to sign up in advance because there's a liability form that needs to be signed, and we just need to know who's coming. So please join us as we clean up Half Moon Bay and really serve together.
We hope to do more things like that as a community, serve together. This is our first one. We also want you to know that the dinner with Fred Harrell that Matt mentioned briefly that we had scheduled for earlier this month, we are rescheduling for September 28th. It's going to be at the Crown Plaza in Foster City. This one's kind of across the highway from the Costco. We're calling it a barn raising, so everyone, if you're under 30, you probably don't know what a barn raising is, but it's kind of this idea from Amish culture where people would come together to build a barn for one family in the community. And the idea is that, like, hey, maybe this isn't, like, maybe you know someone that this isn't their church community, but they're willing to come together to help us build this community. And so that will be September 28th. Please go and RSVP. That'll be $150 a person. You can also reserve a whole table if you want to bring a whole group with you. That'll be a catered dinner, and then we'll have Fred Harrell, who has been a fixture in the Bay Area as a church leader, leading the way with affirming churches. We'll be hearing from him talk about the future of the church and how 12 Church can be a part of building that. So please make plans to join us. You can use that QR code right now just to take you directly to the Eventbrite page to sign up for that. But before we do that, before we move on from our service or end it, we're going to stand together and do one of my favorite 12 Church traditions, which is to sing the doxology together. So use your best if you sing harmony. I am listening because I am recruiting people for the 12 Church band, so please sing loudly. Praise God.